I'm sorry, but the entire restaurant has been privately booked for this evening by Mrs. Delgado. The maitre d' informed my stunned daughter-in-law as she stood in her $3,000 dress at the entrance of Le Bernardin. I watched from my corner table, raising a glass of champagne to Brittany's shocked face as recognition dawned. The two casual mother-in-law she'd banned from family dinners had just rented out one of New York's most exclusive restaurants for my book club's monthly meeting. What she didn't know, what my son had never bothered to mention, was that his immigrant mother who embarrassed them at fancy restaurants was actually Elena Delgado, the woman who'd ghostwritten 3 James Beard award-winning cookbooks and consulted for half the celebrity chefs in Manhattan. It started 6 months ago at my son Marco's birthday dinner. Brittany had chosen per se, making a big show of explaining the wine pairings to everyone while name-dropping her prep school friends who were regulars there. I'd worn my favorite cardigan, soft, comfortable, and apparently unforgivable. Mom, Marco had pulled me aside before we were seated. Brittany mentioned that maybe you'd be more comfortable at, a different kind of restaurant? What kind would that be, Mijo? He'd shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his wife, who was already instructing the sommelier on exactly which vintage she expected. Somewhere more relaxed? You always seem overwhelmed at these places. I'd looked down at my cardigan, my comfortable shoes, my simple jewelry. Then I'd looked at my son, my boy who I'd raised on rice and beans while working 3 jobs, who'd forgotten where he came from the moment he'd married into Brittany's world. If that's what you think is best, I'd said quietly. The relief on his face had stung more than the insult. From then on, I was systematically excluded from their dining experiences. We're going to 11 Madison Park, but don't worry, Mom. We'll come by for coffee after. The chef's table at Daniel is so intimate, really just for couples. You'd hate masa, Mom, all that raw fish. I let them have their exclusion. What they didn't know was that their rejection had freed me to be myself again. My full self, not the diminished version they'd decided I was. 25 years ago, I'd arrived from Mexico City with a suitcase and a notebook full of my grandmother's recipes. I'd worked in restaurant kitchens, not as a chef, which required papers I didn't have then, but as the invisible hand that made sure the mole was authentic, the seasoning was right, the soul stayed in the food even as it got dressed up for American palates. That's where I'd met James Whitman, the celebrity chef who'd built an empire on elevated Mexican cuisine. He'd found me correcting his sous chef's technique with chilies at 2 a.m. in his first restaurant. "Who taught you that?" he'd demanded. "My grandmother. Your way makes the sauce bitter." He'd hired me as a consultant, which really meant I created the dishes he became famous for. When he wrote his first cookbook, he'd insisted I write it with him. Ghostwrite, technically, since his name sold books and mine didn't. "One day, Elena," he'd promised, "your name will be on the cover." But I hadn't cared about fame. I'd cared about feeding my son, keeping a roof over our heads, building something from nothing. The ghostwriting led to more ghostwriting. The consulting led to more consulting. Before long, I was the secret weapon of New York's culinary elite. The woman who could fix your menu, save your cookbook, teach you the difference between appropriation and appreciation. Marco knew none of this. I'd kept my work life separate, not out of shame but out of protection. My son didn't need to carry the weight of his mother's sacrifice, the nights I'd spent perfecting someone else's signature dish while he slept in the restaurant's office. But now, watching him choose his wife's snobbery over his mother's presence, I decided it was time for a revelation. The book club was my first move. Not an actual book club, though we did occasionally discuss novels between courses, but a gathering of women like me. Maria, who designed the interior of every Thomas Keller restaurant. Luz, whose textile company supplied linens to the city's top tables. Yuki, who imported the specialty ingredients that made Michelin stars possible. We were the invisible infrastructure of fine dining, the ones who made the magic happen while staying behind the curtain. "Ladies," I'd announced at our last meeting, "I'm tired of eating at home. What if we took our monthly dinners public?" "Where?" Maria had asked. "Most of us have been quietly banned from the places we helped create." "Exactly. So let's remind them who we are." The plan was simple. Each month, one of us would rent out an entire restaurant for our book club. We'd pay full price. We all had money. That was never the issue. The issue was visibility, the right to exist in spaces we'd helped build. I chose Le Bernardin for my month because I knew Brittany's routine. She had a standing reservation for the third Friday, her networking dinner, where she held court with other trophy wives and discussed charity galas and SoulCycle instructors. I called Eric Reipert personally. We'd worked together 15 years ago when he was developing his cookbook. I'd spent 2 months teaching him the Mexican techniques he'd incorporated into his revolutionary fusion chapter. Elena, of course, anything for you. The whole restaurant, consider it done. One more thing, I'd added. If someone named Brittany Delgado shows up with a reservation, could you handle it personally? With pleasure, he'd said, understanding immediately. The restaurant world was small. Everyone knew who really made things work. The night arrived. I wore my favorite cardigan again, cashmere, but simple. Around me, 25 women who'd shaped New York's culinary landscape without credit laughed over wine I'd chosen without a sommelier's assistance. Did you see the Times review of that new kaiseki place? Yuki was saying. They're calling the pottery innovative. I've been importing those exact pieces for 30 years. At least they noticed the pottery, Luz laughed. My tablecloths are apparently invisible perfection. Which I suppose is the point. That's when the commotion at the door started. Brittany's voice, pitched high with indignation, carried across the dining room. This is impossible. I have a standing reservation. Check again. Eric himself had appeared, calm and apologetic. I'm so sorry, madam, but as I explained, the entire restaurant has been privately booked for this evening by Mrs. Delgado. Delgado? Brittany's voice sharpened. That's my name. My husband's name. There must be a mistake. No mistake. Mrs. Elena Delgado. She's hosting her book club. I watched Brittany scan the room, her gaze sliding over our table once, twice, before stopping. The recognition, the confusion, the dawning horror. It was better than any meal I'd ever prepared. She marched over, Marco trailing behind. Elena? What is this? Hello, Brittany. Marco. I took a sip of wine. This is my book club. We meet monthly. Usually at someone's home, but we decided to branch out. Your book club? Can afford Le Bernardin? The whole restaurant. Well, I could hardly rent half. I gestured to an empty chair. Would you like to join us? Though you might feel overdressed. We're very casual here. Marco was staring around the room, finally noticing details that had escaped him for years. The way the head waiter deferred to me. The ease with which these casual women navigated the space. The fact that Eric Reipert himself was now approaching our table. Elena. Eric kissed both my cheeks, the amuse-bouche is ready. Should I send it out? Please. And Eric, this is my son Marco and his wife. They were hoping to dine here tonight. Any family of Elena's is family of mine, Eric said warmly. Elena, did you ever tell them about our cookbook? She's too modest. Half those recipes were hers. The soul of the book, really. Brittany's mouth opened and closed like a fish on ice. Mom, Marco finally managed. You know Eric Reipert? I know many people, Mijo. But you seem to think I'd be overwhelmed by them, so I kept my friendships separate. Friendships? Brittany's voice was faint. Maria leaned over. Oh yes. Elena's connected to everyone. She's the one who... Maria, I interrupted gently. They don't need the details. After all, I might embarrass them with my casual ways. The dinner proceeded. My friends, sensing blood in the water, but too classy to circle obviously, simply continued their conversations. Discussions of upcoming projects, name drops that made Brittany's eyes widen, casual mentions of connections that revealed the invisible network that actually ran New York's food scene. The Met Gala menu? Luz was saying. Yes, I'm consulting on that. Elena, you should do the Mexican fusion course, if you have time between your other projects. What other projects? Marco asked desperately. I smiled at my son. Nothing that would interest you. Just some casual work. You know how I am, not sophisticated enough for the real culinary world. Brittany had gone very quiet, her perfect makeup unable to hide the flush creeping up her neck. Though, I added, turning to her, I did notice you posted about Daniel Balud's new cookbook last week. Beautiful book. I should know. I tested every recipe. Ghost work, of course, but satisfying. You're in food? Brittany whispered. Oh, I dabble. Nothing as sophisticated as having a standing reservation, of course. Just little things. Writing cookbooks for famous chefs. Consulting for restaurants. Fixing menus that have lost their soul. Casual work. Eric returned, this time with Daniel Balud himself. The restaurant world really was small. Elena, I heard you were here. That mole recipe you adjusted. We've had 3 proposals for franchising based on that dish alone. Daniel, I stood to kiss his cheeks. You remember my son Marco? And his wife, who was just admiring your book. Daniel beamed at Brittany. A fan. How wonderful. Though between us, that book is really Elena's. I just put my name on it. She's too generous, letting us take credit for her genius. The rest of the evening blurred into a parade of chefs and restaurateurs, each stopping by to pay respects, each revealing another piece of my carefully hidden history. The woman they'd deemed too casual, too simple, too embarrassing for their sophisticated dinners was apparently the secret ingredient in half of New York's culinary success stories. Marco excused himself twice. Brittany didn't move, just sat frozen as her worldview rearranged itself course by course. Finally, as dessert was served, a special creation Eric had made in honor of the woman who taught him that food without story is just calories. My son found his voice. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? That I worked. You knew that. That you were this. He gestured helplessly at the room full of culinary luminaries treating me like royalty. Would it have mattered? When Brittany decided I wasn't sophisticated enough for your dinners, would knowing I'd written cookbooks have changed anything? Or would you have just been embarrassed by a different aspect of me? That's not, Brittany started. Fair. I turned to her. No, what's not fair is being excluded from my own son's life because I wear comfortable shoes and don't name drop. What's not fair is being judged by someone who thinks sophistication can be bought at Barney's. I didn't know. Exactly. You didn't know. You didn't ask. You looked at the surface and decided the inside wasn't worth exploring. I stood, my book club following suit. But thank you, Brittany. Your exclusion gave me permission to stop pretending I needed your approval. Mom, please. You're welcome to join us next month, I said, softening slightly at his stricken face. Maria is renting out 11 Madison Park. Very casual, of course. We might even wear cardigans. I left them there, surrounded by the ruins of their assumptions. My friends and I finished our evening at my apartment, laughing over tea and the simple cookies I'd made that morning. The ones that had launched James Whitman's career when I'd taught him the recipe 20 years ago. That was cruel, Elena, Maria said, but she was smiling. No, I corrected. That was honest. Cruelty would have been letting them continue thinking their little reservations meant anything in a world I helped build. My phone buzzed all night, Marco apologizing, begging to understand, promising things would be different. I didn't answer. He'd had years to see me, to ask about my work, to wonder why his immigrant mother could afford to help him through college working casual jobs. Brittany, to her credit, sent only one text. I'm sorry. I was wrong. About everything. Maybe she was. Maybe she'd even learn from it. But I was done caring about the opinions of people who confused price tags with worth, who thought sophistication was about knowing which fork to use rather than knowing how to feed souls. The next morning, I sat in my kitchen, working on my own cookbook. Finally, after all these years, one with my name on the cover. The dedication was already written. To all the women who were too casual for the tables they set, too simple for the stages they built, too humble for the recognition they deserved. This is our recipe for revenge. Success served at exactly the right temperature. Marco showed up while I was testing recipes, using his old key. Mom, there's coffee, I said without looking up from my notes. He poured himself a cup, sat at the table where he'd done homework, while I developed dishes that would make other people famous. I was an ass, he said simply. Yes. Brittany was worse. Also yes. Will you forgive us? I looked at my son, really looked at him. Somewhere under the suit and the pretensions was still the boy who'd done homework in restaurant kitchens, who'd fallen asleep to the sound of me practicing knife skills. I'll consider it, I said finally. But forgiveness isn't a reservation you can just book. It has to be earned. Course by course. How do I start? I pushed a cutting board toward him. Dice these onions. Properly, the way I taught you when you were 10. Before you forgot where you came from. He picked up the knife, muscle memory returning slowly. As he worked, I told him stories about the restaurants, the chefs, the invisible women who made the culinary world turn. About his mother, who he'd never really known. Why ghostwriting? He asked eventually. Why not take credit? Because feeding people mattered more than fame. Because your school clothes mattered more than my name on a menu. Because I thought teaching you to be kind mattered more than teaching you to be important. I paused. I might have been wrong about that last part. You weren't, he said quietly. I just forgot the lesson. Maybe he had. Maybe he could remember. Maybe Brittany would learn that sophistication meant recognizing the extraordinary in the ordinary, the profound in the casual, The genius in the grandmother's recipe adjusted for an American palate. Or maybe they wouldn't. Either way, I had 24 restaurants booked for the next 2 years of book club dinners, a cookbook contract with my actual name on it, and a cardigan that had outlasted every trend Brittany had ever chased. Turns out, casual was the most sophisticated choice I'd ever made.